Ken,
Thank you,
good
David.
to see you.
It's a pleasure.
So at this point, we probably ought to talk about two or three of the issues that are particularly important, and we might as well start off with a real tough one. In your business, your line of work, you are familiar with financial institutions, banking, insurance, and some of these difficult industries that are having financial trouble these days. And maybe the first thing to do is to get, from your perspective, what this really means to banks on Main Street in Searsport. Are we all right, or do we have problems over the horizon that are going to threaten Maine people?
Well, there are obviously some grave problems facing the financial situation here in the United States, and they come from years of excess, of imprudent investments on Wall Street, and imprudent investments driven by greed, but not tempered by the other side of the equation that's supposed to work on Wall Street, which is fear. Because folks who have entered into these complex mortgage derivatives have done it without fear because of an implicit government backing from two big institutions called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which have been supported over the years by various congressional interests that have also been involved very intimately with the people running those institutions. So the bottom line is that system is crumbling and needs to be fixed, and needs to be reformed, and needs to be remade. The good news is that here in Maine and in many places around America, we have a very stable financial system in local banks, credit unions, and conservatively run institutions that haven't been involved in any of this mess. And they have deposits. Deposits are insured by the FDIC and by other very solvent institutions that haven't been involved in this credit mess. So if you go down to Camden National Bank, for example, my friend Paul Duty, who's a commercial lender there, I was talking to him the other day. I said, Paul, I mean, has credit frozen up? Are you making loans to small businesses? He said, no, we've got plenty of money to lend out. We're doing okay here. The problem exists with these big investment banks on Wall Street. And frankly, I think there has to be a day of reckoning for these folks who have made, the fear element has to come back into the equation.
Well, they've certainly taken advantage of the system, knowing that there was someone there to pull their chestnuts out of the fire should they make poor decisions. But the difference is that the local banks, whether they're federally chartered or whether they're chartered here in the state, have to meet certain fundamental requirements. They have to have money to back up the loans they make. They require credit checks, statements of income, all of which are there for one purpose, which is to guarantee that they're not putting their members' money at risk and not extending credit to individuals or institutions that cannot or will not be able to make good on their responsibility.
Right, and anybody who's been doing business with local banks understands that in the last few years they felt maybe a little bit of a competitive disadvantage. They couldn't offer the zero-down mortgage when maybe somebody else who had connections to this Wall Street finance system did. So I think we're going to be okay, but we have to make sure that that there isn't this moral hazard, that the folks on Wall Street that caused this problem, that created the mess, aren't given a free pass and allowed to continue and maybe do it again in the future.
Well, from the standpoint of a Maine legislator, of course, we don't have any control on what the bill is that gets passed in Washington or what goes on in the banking system and investment banks on Wall Street. But we do have some control over the solvency of the state of Maine, the Maine budget, spending, taxation, banking regulations, investments, bond issues, and I know that these are things that you've been concerned about and interested in. And what can you tell us about your attitude and your plan for stabilizing the Maine economy, and what needs to happen here?
Well, Dave, we really need to set priorities in the state legislature. Unfortunately, what's been going on in the past is all too often a legislator comes up with an idea for a new program or a new widget or something in state government that is going to benefit somebody, a constituent, or some other group. And they pass the legislation without thinking about how it's going to be paid for. And when the budget gets tight, what happens is, because the state constitution requires a balanced budget, we can't deficit spend in Augusta. We're not allowed to. We don't have the ability to do what the federal government does, thankfully. Bond issues are often used as a backstop. Well, one of the consequences of this dysfunction on Wall Street right now is it's going to be really difficult to issue those bonds. There's not going to be as much easy credit for the state of Maine. So we're really going to have to knuckle down and take a look at the priorities of the state of Maine, figure out where we ought to be allocating funds to do the best job for the people rather than just for the system and the bureaucracy in Augusta.
Well, and I know that Maine has made some financial decisions over the last 10 or 15 years that are rather disquieting in the light of all of this. We have about a $5 billion overall debt, as I recall, the state retirement system. I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but it is substantially in the hole. We have some $400 million of outstanding bonds, as I recall. And even though the legislature passed additional taxes for the Dirigo health insurance plan, which we'll get into in a few minutes, it has still been a loss leader in the state and not covering its own expenses or its expectations. So that's a big job, Ken, and I know that you and the other legislators are going to have to keep a very, very wary eye on spending and revenue to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a huge budget deficit, as some municipalities, counties, and states have around the country in the last few years.